Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, and I lead you through these interviews from time to time. And those of you who've watched the show probably know that on occasion we spend our time with one guest in a series that we've dubbed Voices of Our Lives. There are a number of people who have affected our movement in important and serious ways, and I'm pleased to say that one of them is here with us today, Kerry Lobel, who is currently the Executive Director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Welcome, Kerry.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad you're here and glad that you stopped by while you were in LA.
Yeah, me too.
You know, it's interesting to me, of course, since I've known you for probably 25 years.
Right,
that,
exactly.
A number of people said to me when you were became the Executive Director at the task force recently, Kerry Lobel, she's a new face, a fresh face in the movement.
If only it were so.
Where did she come from? And it is interesting to me because a number of people in our movement were activists and had a history in other movements, but often when come on the scene in our gay and lesbian movement, people aren't really aware of it. So in keeping with our sort of biographical series, I'm really glad you're here, and want you, if you would, give us a little notion of who you are, where you came from. How did this all start?
How did it all start? Well, you know, it started at the beginning with my grandparents who came over on the boat from Russia and Poland, like many people did. So I come from a family of first-generation parents who moved to New York, who went through that kind of struggle that first-generation children do. My grandparents were people who, in this country, were very working-class folks. My grandfather on my father's side was a tailor. On my mother's side, my grandfather sort of skipped out after first coming to this country. He was a little too fast for my grandmother, and so, you know, I come from a long line of women who were raised by my grandmother, who worked 3 jobs to raise them. So that sort of hopefulness of the new country tempered by, you know, the economic reality of what it was to be a woman alone.
Because they were not working class in Russia?
They weren't. They were part of a merchant class, and I think there were many people who fled Russia during the pogroms who, because of the economic turmoil there, thought it would be much better for them and their families here, which for my family ended up, you know, not really immediately being the case, and the kinds of stories that you read or pictures that you see about how tough it was for women in particular who knew very little of the language to come to this country and try to survive alone was very much the story of my grandmother. And then, you know, after the war, my parents were very much like people were in the mid-40s, who they decided that they wanted to flee the cities of New York, and they fled to the San Fernando Valley, of all places, which, you know, in the 40s was orchards and turkey farms and cheap housing, and we lived in a house that was about this big that bordered on the Ford motor plant. You know, and we had I remember we had like a duck in our backyard.
Well, the San Fernando Valley is very different now, of course, than it was.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
So a Valley girl, who would have thought?
Exactly. I mean, you know, I was a Valley girl before, you know, the Zappas proclaimed the Valley girl thing, but I was very much a child of the Valley, but I was also a Jewish child of the Valley. And so being raised in my part of the Valley, there were not many Jews who lived there. I was very isolated from Jewish community, and again, that was largely an economic issue for my family. But my first sort of hint that I was different was in elementary school when a kid called me a Christ killer and a matzo ball eater. I was like, yeah, I eat matzo balls, what's that about? But at that time, you know, there was very strong animosity between Jews and Catholics that, you know, I was very shocked to learn at a young age. And I remember being in school and mouthing the words to Christmas carols because I knew I wasn't supposed to sing them. I mean, things that are very, very different today, although people would like to change that, of course.
Yes, of course.
Of course they would.
So this sense of difference and isolation, how did it manifest itself when you were in high school? I mean, I know you from when we met when you were a student at UCLA, right, which we'll get to in a few minutes, but you were, you know, very outspoken and very comfortable in that difference. Was that the case before you got to college?
You know, I was a lot like many young people who were different. I was very much a reader. I had my sort of own idea about how you should look and how you should dress, and I was a big Girl Scout and competed for all these merit badges, but when I was in high school, I realized I was quite different, as in my senior year, I walked around campus with these Billy Jack hats on, this long overcoat, any season of the year, Oxfords without shoes, and hung around with this crowd of people that were sort of high school anti-war activists. And I remembered on the way over here that one of our big campaigns was to try to protect a piece of grass in the middle of our campus at James Monroe High from cementing over.
Huh.
And, you know, they were a bunch of sort of oddballs, just like me. A lot of them were people who were involved with theater, which I was as well, but definitely people who did not fit in. And so for my mother, who very much wanted to have a daughter who was kind of like everyone else, she didn't quite know what to do. I was always encouraged to kind of go my own way, but I think the Billy Jack hat, the coat and the shoes was a bit much. Now that I look back at those pictures, it was quite odd. You know, it was very, very odd.
Well, it's a statement. I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's interesting to me.
Yes.
A number of folks who've been on the show, you know, David Mixner and Paul Manette and Phil Wilson and Tori Osborne. If you look at their pictures in junior high and high school, it was, with only a few exceptions, I think, pretty much the the anti-assimilationist kind of stuff, whether they had any gay identity yet or not.
Right.
Because I think you make a choice. I am going to embrace that and kind of flaunt it, because in my case, the opposite was never possible. I was never going to be able to be assimilated, no matter what.
Right.
So you were a bit of an iconoclast, I guess. But was there politics to it?
You know, there was the politics that came from being a Jew, from having sort of cultural pride, from knowing that I was part of a rich history of struggle. There was a politics of what it was like to be in high school during the Vietnam War, and being very blessed to have teachers at high school who sort of taught how much the war cost versus how much it was going to feed people. I mean, the first discussions really for me about, you know, a defense budget. So I think for me, high school was a very politicizing experience, and again, I was drawn to people who couldn't fit in. I mean, I was certainly someone who I don't think could have fit in. Maybe I could have. I never tried to fit in. And they tended to be people who were outspoken. And, you know, I learned that was a way that you got some attention for yourself, and that it was a productive way to use being different. And, you know, in our own way, we became as popular as those people who did the traditional football, cheerleader things. We stood out, which was good. It was a very good exercise. But I don't think I thought of myself then as political. I thought of myself as someone who did what had to be done at a time when something had to happen.
Well, it's an interesting thing to carry on, because as I see you, that's kind of been an impulse that's gone all along.
Yep.
I mean, there's instead of, although I see you as a thinker, instead of I think, therefore I am, it's more like I do, therefore I am.
Right,
you know?
exactly.
Is there something that has to be done? I better do it.
Right, then you think about it afterward and you say, and I did this because blah, blah, blah. It's like, oh no, that's not really true.
Well, clarity of purpose is always in hindsight anyway, I think.
It certainly has been for me.
So what made you decide to go to college?
Well,
was that a tradition in your family?
No, I was the first person in my family to go to college, and it was very important to my parents that I be able to go. My mother in particular had always wanted to go to college and couldn't because of my family's economic situation and because she was expected to marry. So it was always thought that I would go to college. I always knew from the time I was 5 years old I wanted to be a doctor. So of course you had to go to college, unfortunately, to do that, although not everyone does.
Yeah.
But so I knew that I wanted to go, but I also knew that it was my way out. And it was very important to me not to go to college in the San Fernando Valley where I lived, which seemed to me to be a very sort of isolated, small place. And
so you went away to college?
I went away to college, which was 20 minutes over the hill into Westwood, but seemed like a lifetime away. And in those days, it really was. I mean, now when I think about it, it was like, why was that such a big deal? But then, and I think even in some respects now, the geographic thing about being in the middle of the valley and going over the hill, the economic differences between my part of the valley and the other part of the valley, but just the physical act of making the separation was important. And most of the people that I went to school with ended up going to school in the Valley. So it was an odd thing to have done, and I was very clear that I was either getting out or I wasn't going to college. And fortunately, I had the kind of grades that I needed to be able to escape. And you know, it was a good thing. It was a good time to escape.
What was it like going to UCLA that first year?
It was exciting. I mean, first of all, I came from the Valley, which was small, to UCLA, which had like 30,000 people. I mean, it's bigger than most towns in the United States. So it was a little bit overwhelming. And I learned in my first semester that I could not be pre-med because I hated math and science. So that was a little bit startling. Suddenly it was like I had no idea what I was going to be when I grew up, because the thing I had always known I was going to be was not going to be possible. And it was also, you know, it was a lonely time trying to find myself and trying to find community in that big place. And I really struggled in that first year. And had the occasion at the end of that first year to work at a Jewish children's camp outside of Southern California, which really was one of those kinds of events that completely changed my life, because I met a woman and bam, there I went.
So you went away to camp. This is sounding very familiar. Exactly the same thing had happened to me 10 years before.
Right.
And so you had no sense before that that you might be a lesbian. I mean...
Not really. I mean, you know, always, I think you tend to look back and you say, well, I should have seen this sign, or I should have seen that sign. And I certainly realized that I had had this, what I would call a crush now, on another young woman in high school. But at the time, I just thought, I really like her. She's really smart. But I also, Sheila, I wrote these, like, you know, 3 volumes of poetry that were very heartfelt and very passionate. But at the time, it was like, I didn't connect. I mean, I don't think I was in denial. I just didn't have any sense of what a lesbian was. I knew one bisexual girl in high school, but I mean, I didn't even really know like what to be a bisexual was, or what to be gay, or what to be lesbian was. That was just not discussed in my school or in my family. So when I went to camp, and you know, camp is this already isolating, surreal experience, and I met this woman, I was like, what in the world is this? Do I just like her? Am I a lesbian? She was identified as bisexual. But I knew that nothing had ever hit me quite as hard as that. I mean, life literally, like, stopped. You know, I was just completely swept off my feet.
Then you have to come back to Southern California to go back to UCLA. So
right.
What happened?
Well, I was walking into school, and on one of these little things that they have, you know, where they post signs, there was this sign, you know, you look for signs in your life, it said, lesbians, myths or realities. And it was a section of a women in psychology class. And I said, lesbian, lesbian. And, you know, I had done a little looking in the library about sort of homosexuality, and learned very quickly that people thought that was a sick and bad thing, but was feeling really like a fish out of water. Went to this class. This woman who was the section leader was the most gorgeous activist lesbian that I have ever met in my entire life. Still stands there with many gorgeous lesbian activists that I've known over the years. And it completely changed my life, because suddenly I was in a community of mostly feminist lesbians where it was very safe to be a feminist, and very safe to be a lesbian, which isn't to say that I didn't sort of struggle through the first several months and try to sleep my way through it with boys and girls, and try to sort of say, well, am I really a lesbian? Am I attracted to women? Am I attracted to men?
Or am I just experimenting?
Am I experimenting? But, you know, I realized that I was very fortunate coming out at UCLA, because everyone was. You know, it was a tremendously exciting and safe time for a student like myself. I don't know that it was so safe for staff or faculty.
Well, it wasn't, because as you know, I was staff then at the same time. And I remember Jan Ora, the woman you're talking about, was the first person ever to say in the Daily Bruin, which is of course the student newspaper at UCLA, that she was a lesbian, and no one had said they were gay or a lesbian, like in print. And it was a very, very courageous thing for her to do, and a great leadership thing for her to do. And she organized, I remember, a gay-straight dialogue.
That's right.
And I was in the student activities office as an assistant dean of students at the time, and it was just as scary to me and didn't feel as simple. And I'm not saying that it was simple in any way for any of the students, because I frankly thought you were all quite courageous in a way that I still at that moment could not. I mean, it's so interesting that it's 25 years now, I think, since then, you know, and how we were in the same room then and the same room now. And
literally in the same room.
And really having done so much parallel work in a number of things. But I remember there was an organization called the Lesbian Sisterhood.
Right, it started out being the Gay Sisterhood.
Oh, yeah.
And it was, you know, there was a women's resource center that was formed on campus, and the Gay Sisterhood, as we were talking about the other day, like moved in. You know, all 5 of us or something like that. And, you know, I'd like to say that it was a hard thing for that to happen, but it was also, you know, the right thing, and I think people needed that kind of safety. I certainly did. I needed a place where I could go and meet other women and talk about issues. And I mean, those meetings were very much in the context of a political environment, though, as well. I mean, we were talking about lesbian feminism, we were talking about the events of the day, and we were also being able to meet lots of different people. UCLA was a center of a place where lots of women from around the country came. So, I mean, it was the most perfect time to come out. And then for someone like me who was really a fairly inexperienced youngster, to be around people like Jan and then to meet people like you. I mean, we talk about sharing the same room. You remember I was your program assistant. I had my little desk over here. You had your big desk over here. You know, I had tremendous opportunities to be around people who really knew what they were doing and was really mentored as a young woman by people who took a great interest in my having skills and being able to think, which, you know, I never took for granted, and which, you know, I feel very concerned now that many young people don't have opportunities for. At that time, I mean, it was a thing that completely changed the direction of my life, to be able to be surrounded by strong women who knew what they were doing and who created a space for me to be able to do what I needed to do.
Well, it was a very heady time. I mean, the early 70s, and on college campuses too. It was the sort of the dovetailing of the anti-war movement, the student power movement, which was an element of that. Certainly the Black Student Union and MECHA started on campus, the Asian American, Asian Pacific, I can't remember what, they had there was a coalition, I remember, that began at the very beginning. It was a very exciting and interesting time. And when the women's movement kind of, you know, took hold in the early 70s and we opened the Women's Resource Center, there was a lot of space to explore protest or sort of anti-status quo work, which really opened the space for people to be able to identify themselves comfortably almost as against the status quo, which was not the case when I was in college, you know, 10 years earlier, where conformity was absolutely de rigueur.
And as you say, I mean, it was at a time when other movements were really coming to the fore at campus as well. So I remember very much parallel to each other, we were having the fights together about would there be a women's newspaper, would there be a black newspaper, would there be a Jewish newspaper. And so it was also a tremendous time of coalition building where people really, I thought, watched each other's backs very, very closely. There wasn't that kind of turfism, there wasn't that kind of if you get it, I can't get it. People tried to, I think, be very intentional about doing work together, which was also, I think, a very important lesson of that time. I mean, the people who stood out were the people who were wanting to maintain the status quo. I mean, they were losers. You know, that was not what was happening then. And
well, it's also been a thread through your work that I've seen as you went along, that this recognition of the similarities and this outsider status that I think the status quo always tried to pit against each other.
Right.
And the work had to be to essentially reject that notion and to embrace the understanding that although we're outsiders in different ways, that's a very powerful coalition.
Yep.
And really the question is sort of the Marat Sade question, you know, who's inside, who's outside.
Right, exactly.
Who's crazy and who's sane.
Exactly. And it's, you know, there was this big house of cards that was constructed that was based on this notion that if people didn't talk with each other, that this house could stand. And you know, what I learned over and over again was every time you talked to someone who was outside of your circle, something started to shift, and those people that wanted to have power and control suddenly were really quite at a loss, you know, of what to do. And UCLA taught me that in a very big way.
Well, and in terms of power and control, I mean, the next thing I knew of you doing was a very central role in the fledgling movement against domestic violence. Talk about how your work started in that.
Well, you know, as my mother would say, if there's an underdog issue, you're going to go and find it. And that was certainly the case in the mid-'70s, that there were very few services for battered women. And at UCLA, through a number of things that I'd done, I was meeting women who'd been abused and who had no resources. And when I left UCLA, I ended up working quite accidentally, really, at a shelter for battered women. And it was collectively run, so it was a feminist program inside a larger organization. Sojourn was the shelter, Ocean Park Community Center was the organization. It was a very unique program for its time, and there still aren't programs that were like it. I mean, it's made a profound change in the battered women's movement around the country. And for me, it was very much a place where I could work on a lot of issues. The battered women's movement was a place where everything came together: housing, childcare, economics, welfare, immigration. You had to work on all of those things. And at the same time, I remember giving speeches about domestic violence and having people stand up at Rotary Club meetings and say, "You're lying.
Right.
There's no such thing as a battered woman." I mean, now people might say they don't know one, but I don't know of anyone who says it doesn't happen. But you know, 20 years ago, people stood up routinely and said, women are not battered. If they are, they deserve it, which people still say. But no one would admit that they knew someone. And so, you know, I was very honored to be among some of those very brave women, those first battered women who spoke out and who took a lot of risk. I mean, they took the kind of risk that, you know, lesbians and gay men and bisexuals and transgendered people take in speaking out. People said, "You're crazy, you deserve it, you need to go back to where you came from," and really had to deal with a lot of stigma. So it was a good time. I mean, it was also a place in Southern California where a lot of things were coming together, and where there was an opportunity to grow a movement that could bring together battered women, but also could really challenge some of those institutions that were being very uncooperative, like police and city attorney and district attorney, and you know, some of the people now who are quite in the news, like Johnny Cochran, who was the chair of the Domestic Violence Council that I helped form when I was working in Southern California, in the Southern California Coalition on Battered Women. I mean, a lot of us go way back through all of these, you know, these intertwinings, and that's certainly a way that we had re-intertwined as well.
Right. When I had just gotten out of law school, you came and said, "Can I take you to lunch?" or "You take me to lunch?" And
yeah, I'm sure I said you take me to lunch. Rich
asked
lawyer.
me to start a resource board for Sojourn. I had never heard of domestic violence in my life, and you know, now 20 years later, I'm listed on my own biography, I should say, as a national expert.
Right.
And, yeah, it certainly changed my life. Well, I think people do that for each other. It's really interesting when you were talking about being mentored, and yet I've also felt mentored by you in the work that you did in the domestic violence movement. I mean, we have that same sort of activist, gee, something needs to be done.
Right.
Somebody's hurting, I better go do something,
Right.
you know. But it was interesting when you were talking about really the imposition of silence, which is what I think had happened to so many battered women.
Yep.
Shame, same thing that happens in our community.
Yep.
And your mother saying, you know, if there's a cause, you'll take it up. But I was curious when you mentioned your mother, you decided fairly rapidly, I guess, well, that's me, I'm a lesbian. Did you tell your parents?
I did what Jean Cordova, I think, called the oops method of coming out.
Oh dear.
Where you're with your parents and they say, "I'm really concerned that, you know, this company that you're keeping is not good, and I'm afraid that you're going to be a lesbian." Oops, I am. So my mother had a major motherly crash over it that lasted many, many years, which left me very estranged from my family. And so I think she always felt that everything that I did, with few exceptions, added insult to injury. So first I was a lesbian, and I wasn't going to give her grandchildren. then I'm like talking about battered women's issues at a time when people think battered women are sick and crazy. So I was starting down this path of motherly disapproval, and you know, for me it was a very hard thing. I mean, coming from a large extended family and being very disconnected from my mother, and having my father and my brother say for 15 or so years, your mom's not mad at you, she's just having a bad day. You know, again, I really understood that kind of crazy-making situation that so many of us have when we're disconnected from our families, and where we don't know necessarily what ground we have to stand on. I mean, I was very fortunate that I had sort of the personal resources and friends around me that I could build my own family and community. But you know, many years later, when I moved from Southern California to Arkansas, and I had this very painful fight with my mother, she said, you know, you've been dead to me for 15 years. It was such a relief, because I'd felt crazy.
Because your dad was saying, no, she's not angry, she's just having a bad day.
Yeah, and I was
but
like,
the truth was that she had completely written you out of her life.
Right, like I didn't get a call from my mother, you know, unless someone was dead. So there was this moment where I was completely freed by my mother's telling the truth. And it was a big gift to me, you know, because I felt like in my life I had really tried to tell the truth, that I stayed away from my family because I didn't feel like I could tell the truth. And then my mother freed me by telling a very hard truth, which then created an environment a couple of years later where I could say to myself, you know, you stopped trying with your family. So if something, God forbid, should happen to them, will you feel like you did your part? And my partner at that time said, do you feel like you would have done your part? And I was like, you know, no, I don't. So I really, you know, I tried very hard with my parents to make some kind of amends, a new relationship. And fortunately, just before my father died, we had really started on the right track. And when he did die, then it sort of left my mom and my brother and me to create a different life, with me being, you know, at that time, this lesbian who was doing prison and HIV and AIDS work and work with prostitutes. Oh my God, in Arkansas of all places.
And worse.
She's exactly. I think she thought, you know, I'd completely lost my mind.
Well, but how did you get to Arkansas? I mean, you were doing work about battered women here in essentially in Santa Monica.
Right, I've been doing work in Southern California. I decided after a couple of years working at the shelter that as much as I appreciate people who do that day in, day out direct service, that was not for me. I was much more of an institutional, confrontational kid. And stepped into directing the Southern California Coalition on Battered Women, which I did for 5 years.
Which was a coalition of the shelters?
Yeah, 30 shelters throughout Southern California, San Diego to Santa Barbara. And, you know, learned a lot about coalition building and confronting institutions and state legislature and wheeling and dealing and training and technical assistance and running the state, and had been involved politically in Santa Monica where I was living, ran for city council as an out lesbian, lost, was on the city planning commission.
But you were the first person ever to run for that council out, right?
Oh yeah, and there, you know, it wasn't till a little bit later when Judy Abdo ran that that another lesbian did. It was very fortunate when I ran that, you know, I got the endorsement of the Police and Firefighters Association. I mean, it was our opposition at that time really chose not to make an issue of my being a lesbian. I mean, some of the sort of people on my side politically were more worried about how it would fly, but then it was never an issue in my campaign.
No, and I think your opponents were quite wise, because it was very much the same in my campaign. It felt to me like it would have hurt them.
Yeah.
To be that homophobic, and you know, especially in Santa Monica, which didn't care that much about it.
And still doesn't, you know, I mean, doesn't care at all. I mean, Santa Monica is one of those interesting places where lots of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people live, but there isn't much of a movement there.
No, it's not really a gay town. I mean, it's a very political town.
Right,
and
but it's never been
like,
a gay
never
town.
mind that. How do you stand on rent control?
Exactly, and that was it. Like when they said, what is your big secret? I was like, I eat Big Macs. You know, like that was more of a sin. So, you know, I ran and I lost, and that opened up a space in me to start thinking about, is it time to leave Southern California? And like many things in our life that moves us unexpectedly, I got involved with a woman who lived in Arkansas. We started seeing each other a long distance, and I said, I could move to Arkansas for a couple of years. Oh my God, you know, I was a Southern California kid and moved to Arkansas where I knew nearly no one. And it was major cultural trauma. And I lived there 10 years, and it was the best 10 years of my entire life, politically and in every other way.
So what did you do in Arkansas?
Well, I worked at an organization called the Women's Project, which is a very special organization. There are very few like it around the country, that works on places where gender and race and sexual orientation intersect. So I did a lot of domestic violence work around HIV and AIDS, women in prison issues, hate crimes, GL, wasn't really so much BT issues then.
Right.
But the Women's Project really was the center for sort of progressive political thinking. And if you could scheme it, you could do it. I mean, it was never that kind of, well, you can't do that. So I ended up doing a lot of work that I never thought I would do, working with lots of different kinds of people, working with women who were working as prostitutes. I did a lot of work at the state women's prison, and you know, I found my sort of political stride there. It was a great place to get the kinds of political skills that I never would have gotten, I think, staying in Southern California. Because you could call someone and say, I want to do that. They'd be like, okay. Mm-hmm. You didn't get, you know, put through 27 different people, mm-hmm. you know, who were on the food chain who were all going to say no to you. So it was very quick and fun.
There was something kind of special for you, though. I know we were talking before about this, in terms of your work with women in prison. Will you talk more about that?
Sure. I had, for many, many years, been drawn to women in prison. I don't know if it was those 50s prison movies.
Ida Lupino.
Exactly, Ida Lupino. This total attraction to that sense of women as outlaws, women who'd gone against the grain. And, you know, it's sort of not it doesn't take a lot of sort of smarts to sort of realize that I saw myself as a person who'd sort of historically gone against the grain. And so I ended up being able to do a support group for women in prison at the state prison, and it was supposed to last 6 weeks. We were supposed to rotate. At the end of the 6 weeks, I said, I'm not leaving. 6 years later, I was still there, going down to the prison 2-3 times a week, doing HIV work, battered women's work, prison transportation program, bringing magazines and books. And I felt when I was there like it was one of the few places in my life where I was fully myself, and where the work that I did made a very critical difference to women who felt very much like me. I mean, I saw myself in many of the women that I worked with. I thought, you know, I'd had opportunities that they hadn't had, and in some respects, for many of them, because of their involvement with the wrong woman or the wrong man, their life took a turn, and because they were poor mostly, they pled guilty to a crime, which generally they did commit. Many of them were women who'd killed their batterers in self-defense. But I was very drawn to the women who wouldn't toe the line. So here I was, you know, the big dyke, who'd written this book on lesbian battering in a prison, doing HIV and AIDS education in a sodomy state where you weren't allowed to talk about same-gender sex, feeling like I was home with a bunch of women who were like not liked that well by the prison administration, starting all of these peer-led programs. And so all the kind of issues that I had with power and control that are completely about my life, well, there I was.
But it was a little bit, I mean, it's interesting because it reminds me of kind of studenthood in a way. You can buck the institution, you are not of the institution.
Right.
And in some ways, could the freedom also come from the fact that you could walk out of there?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, I had many nightmares for many years about what it would mean not to be able to walk out. I mean, when I first came there, I had a lot of guilt about being able to walk out, and it was really important to me to try to work to get people out of that place and to ensure that when they did get out of that place that there were resources for them. And I worked in a very heartbreaking way with women who were finally released from prison. A woman who was a good friend of mine who had HIV. We finally got her out on early release, tried to work for her to have the resources she needed when she left. And I mean, she was released from prison with nothing. And if I hadn't known resources, literally, I mean, she was released from prison with 1 day's supply of AZT, which we had fought very hard for her to get. She had no driver's license. She had no access to housing or health care. And so for me, again, it was another place where issues came together. But it was also a place where sort of spiritually I felt like I fit in a, you know, I was the least sort of, I was like the most traditional good girl in the place in a way, because I hadn't committed any crime except once getting arrested for leading a demonstration across the street. But, you know, felt very much like these were my sisters in a way that I've never felt before then or since then.
Well, there is a great power to acceptance when, you know, when everyone is so much of an outlaw.
Yep.
Or outsider, where you, in essence, how can you judge others, you know, when you don't, you certainly wouldn't want to stand and be judged at that moment.
Right.
Although, as you said, poverty is a kind of crime, especially for women of color and especially in the South.
Yep.
For them. So it's not so clear whether people are outlaws or just out making a sin out of, you know, being outsiders.
I mean, it was very clear to me that it was so much about the sin of being an outsider. It was about the sin of not being willing to toe the line, and so many of these women were women who were in very small or large ways challenged the status quo. I mean, some of them did incredibly horrible things for which there is no excuse, but some of them were people who never deserved to be in prison, and none of them deserved the kind of despicable treatment that they had every day and the kind of disrespect that I saw in that system just get worse year after year after year. By the time I left, it was heartbreaking, the kind of overcrowding and, you know, not having access to college courses, groups like mine being like thrown out right and left. I mean, they tried to do everything they could to wear us down so that we would not go back. And you know me, I was like, you
can't wear me down.
I'm coming.
Well, you mentioned that you had edited a book on lesbian battering, and as I recall, in the battered women's movement at that time and even now, there was always a tension about the lesbians in that movement and whether we would admit that there were so many and whatever. I personally always thought that the battered women's movement was always separate from the mainstream women's movement, and that one of the main reasons for that was that it was so lesbian driven, so many of the early shelters.
Yep.
But nobody wanted to talk about that because clearly what we were doing in the minds of the mainstream was letting women escape, or worse than that, you know, pulling them out of their homes rather than have them be killed there, I guess.
Exactly.
And there was some tension in our national coalitions and really in the movement as a whole.
There was, and I mean, I like to think of the battered women's movement as the lesbian branch of the women's movement, although people would probably, you know, not like that characterization.
Well, especially since, you know, people like Ruthie Slaughter don't identify as a lesbian.
No, but their pals were, and you know, but there was that equation that was feminist equals man-hater equals lesbian, and every powerful woman in the battered women's movement, whether she was a lesbian or not, you know, including some of our best friends like Ruth, had to deal with this sort of confrontation about being a lesbian because they supported and protected women in a real authentic way. Every kind of woman, cross race, cross class, cross, you know, age. And it became a very difficult thing around the country because these programs were lesbian baited. Many lesbians felt the need to be invisible. I certainly wasn't one of those, but many people did. And many programs lost funding because of the fear that, you know, the government had once government started getting involved.
Well, the Department of Justice played a big part in that.
Well, the Department of Justice did the sort of classic try to break up and divide the battered women's movement over a big grant it gave the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. It said you can't use the word lesbian. And, you know, when we're talking about battering and not to be able to say lesbians are battered, it was a very difficult thing. And it was one of those times in my life where you had to resolve the question of, would you sacrifice a group for the greater good? And I think, you know, all of us learned a lot from that time, but I find like that choice is constantly thrown, you know, at me in my work. Would the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence continue to take money knowing it couldn't talk about lesbians? It decided not to. Another group of people that felt like the movement needed the money, you know, they weren't wrong to think the movement needed the money. At the time I thought they were wrong and the movement needed the money. But, you know, it was a ridiculous choice for all of us to have had to make. I mean, of course it was right to be able to talk about those issues, but the Department of Justice, under Ed Meese at that time, knew exactly what it was doing to fragment, which it did effectively, the most powerful manifestation of the women's movement that this country has ever seen in, you know, in this time period. It worked, lesbian baiting worked. And the battered women's movement has never been the same since that day, even though there are lesbians and heterosexual women both, bisexual and transgendered women in leadership. There's always that fear that that issue is going to continue to be used as a wedge issue.
Well, and of course it's always been a very effective thing to do to straight women, including now in the military, to say, you must be a lesbian if you won't sleep with me, or whatever men say, and it becomes a very powerful label to put on straight women. And as long as it's something that one can be frightened with, because there are negative consequences in society still to being a lesbian, then it will be a very effective way to drive a wedge into a women's movement that should be even more powerful than it is. But I think it was a very effective tool, if you know what I mean, from the opposition, to say, let's call all the straight women lesbians. If they hang around with lesbians, then they'll want to get rid of the lesbians. That'll take at least half the energy, if not more, out of the movement. And I noticed it was very much at the same time, too, that lesbians were beginning to see gay men as potential allies. Certainly gay men who were becoming politicized because of the AIDS movement. Gay men who had been very in the closet, mainstream, you know, doing their own thing, leave me alone, I'll just want to sort of be invisible and happy, couldn't anymore.
No, that's right. And you know, for many of us who are lesbians in the battered women's movement, we didn't have a lot of contact with gay men. You know, that was not our constituency, that was not our community, and for many lesbians who were doing work with gay men, the battered women's movement was not their community or their constituency. I mean, lesbians were as frightened about battering as the battered women's movement was frightened about lesbians, so the sort of self-fears in our community about lesbian battering also served as a wedge to keep women that I knew who were lesbian activists in other movements from really being able to support the work I was doing around lesbian battering. They hated that we raised that issue.
Well, I have never met a minority community that wanted to admit that there was any battering in the community, because then people would think even worse of us, which is ridiculous, because it only helps in the denial and, you know, in the silence that we're all forced to engage in anyway.
Right, which is really, you know, it's really harmed battered gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people that we've had this silence. I mean, we're still in a place in our communities where there's tremendous silence about that abuse, and it is because we want to have the appearance that, you know, we're just like everyone else, everything's okay. But also we want to hold up that our relationships are somehow different, and for those that were raised, of us that were raised as lesbian feminists, these were, you know, egalitarian, feminist, relationship, partnerships. We didn't understand that you could like have those things, but that battering happened. It was about power and control. One was not related to the other, and that you could confront battering when you saw it.
Well, it's also been a very important part of the battered women's movement to kind of identify it as a gender issue. And if you start talking about gay or lesbian battering, but you can't talk about gender or roles, you know, it doesn't fit in exactly either. And I think that was a very difficult intellectual place for people to get to.
It is now still. I mean, you go to many places in this country and have this discussion with battered women's activists, and it's like, no, you're trying to challenge those theories of patriarchal power and control.
So how do you get from Arkansas to Washington? I mean, I know how President Clinton did it. But what about Kerry Lobel?
Well, Kerry Lobel was tired, and Kerry Lobel was about to take a 6-month sabbatical to figure out what to do with her life, and she had known about the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and its work on hate crimes, and I said, the task force is looking for a deputy director. I'm looking for a change. People that I loved, who tend to be fairly pushy, said, oh, you should do that job, you should do that job. My partner Mary said, honey, I hope you really like to go there and like those people, because I'm really ready to move. And I saw it, you know, as an opportunity to be able to bring skills that I had and bring some order to the task force, which had been doing a little bit of flailing before then. So I just thought it would be fun, you know, and I liked the task force, and I thought it would be an interesting opportunity. I had no idea what I was really getting into, though.
No, because you thought you were going to be deputy, and now there you are, you're the ED.
I know, 2 years later, there I am, the executive director.
Well, part of that flailing, I think, is some complaint around the country that even though the task force has a good reputation, if people are called upon to say what the mission is,
Right.
often they really couldn't come up with the words. So here's your opportunity nationally. What does the task force do?
What the task force does, and what the task force has always done, is recognize that the center of gravity has shifted to local and state communities, and what we do best is to provide support for activists who work in their local and state communities. We help support them in doing what they need to be able to do. Often it's behind the scenes. It's in a no fingerprints kind of way. The worst thing that can happen in many towns is to say, and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force came in and helped us today.
It sounds like, right, rolled in tanks.
Right, exactly. So we try to do a lot of behind the scenes work to strengthen the infrastructure of our movement so that, you know, we're in a situation now where 2 anti-gay bills have been introduced every day this year.
In state legislatures?
In state legislatures. They're not being introduced in Washington, D.C. We've got good state organizations in about 30 states that we've helped nurture over the years. These organizations need to stay in touch with each other. We keep them in touch by phone, by email, through the web, so that they can stay ahead of the curve. We know that the Concerned Women for America, you know, did a cookie-cutter same-gender marriage ban bill. Well, here we were, like, fighting it in 30 different ways in 30 communities. They were calling in the same witnesses, the same bill. It's like, hello, let's use the resources that we have to strengthen infrastructure and move forward our own agenda by fighting back bad bills, but also introducing good bills on hate crimes and sodomy repeals and family issues and student issues. So a lot of what we do is nurture activists at the local and state level through their organizations. But then the other piece of work that we do is we have a think tank where we produce some of the best studies and surveys and written materials so that activists like me who have this big pile of stuff, who can't ever read it or who can't translate some of the academic writing into plain English, have a source where someone says, here, Kerry, here's your 1 page of talking points, here's your sample letter to the editorial letter, here's your editorial, here's, you know, your sample flyer, so that people really can get ahead of the curve. And also so that we're not fighting these same battles 25 years from now. You know what, I don't want to talk about custody and adoption forever. You know, I want to get ahead of where we are. And I would like, you know, next year, and I think we're finally in a place, where next year in a number of states, our movement will introduce on the same day pro-gay bills. We have enough gay and lesbian elected officials around this country where we can do that.
And you know what? My experience in the legislature is you don't even need gay and lesbian elected officials in every state to do that, because the men and women in my legislature, we've got 9 bills. I'm only carrying 1.
Right.
And there's a lot of support for us there. And I think the task force will help immeasurably, especially, I mean, the information that you put out on the web, et cetera, that I see that says, hey, California, guess what just happened in Minnesota and, you know, and in Florida, good, bad, or otherwise. I think it's really important. I think a lot of people see the Human Rights Campaign as a kind of coherent thing they can understand. It lobbies Congress, I get that, you know.
Right.
But it sounds like the missions are very compatible.
Well, they are, and I think one of the things that the 2 groups can do the best is to talk about why our missions are compatible. I mean, I support HRC, and I make a financial contribution to them because I think it's important that we have a voice in Washington that lobbies for us. I support, you know, the Victory Fund because I think it's important that gay and lesbian elected officials be able to run and win. And I support the task force because I believe someone has to support activism at the local and state level. We can't do those pieces in isolation. But the other role that the task force plays, which is in some respects more critical than all of the others, is the task force is the place where the linkages are made. When we talk about coalition building, we look at a state like California, where there's been anti-affirmative action bills and anti-immigration bills. These are the places where queer people have to be visible because we understand that that's how it works. That, first of all, there are queer people of color and queer immigrants, but also that it's going to be through building a coalition that we're going to transform society. And so the task force occupies that progressive, transformational part of that political spectrum that allows groups like HRC to do that kind of important vote counting, negotiating, maneuvering. We're that progressive left that gives other groups the space in which to move, and I think it's very critical.
Very
to our
much in the
progress.
tradition of feminism, too. I mean, which
Absolutely.
is a transformational ethic, and I always have thought so.
It
So,
is.
Kerry, what has this meant to you personally? I mean, in your history, you've been primarily engaged in feminist work, although, engaged in a way in gay lesbian stuff, but now suddenly quite visible as one of a small handful of executive directors
Right.
of these, organizations.
Right.
And it must feel personally different to you. What has it meant?
Well, it feels personally different in two ways. One is it's just very different work. I mean, there's a very different constituency. This is a really vibrant time for our movements where there's a lot of attention and where we're trying to figure out who we want to be and where we want to go and what we want to do. And so for me to try to bring transformational politics to that, to say, we don't want to be just like everyone else. We want to create our own space. We want to bring our whole selves to the table. I mean, for me, it's personally very challenging and feels like a complete connection with all of work that I've ever done, which is to be about being able to, bring yourself to safety and to justice and know that the work would change because of that. But it's also been a compelling time because I had to make the decision to take this job at a time in my own life where sort of major personal transformation was happening for me internally. We were talking before about, the fact that my brother died in June, killed himself quite unexpectedly. And so I've been dealing with having to do some reconnection with my family in a very different way, but also have to deal with the kind of tension about my brother's death. I mean, he was a person who was a principal, well-loved in his community, had this incredibly vibrant public life where everyone thought they knew him. But he was also a man who had lots of secrets and was arrested in an adult movie theater, spent a night in jail, came home, took his own life. And so for me, here I am, the big dyke, the public dyke, who's for 25 years made peace with the life that I lead, built family for myself around the life that I lead, and now have to deal with sort of a loss of a person that I thought had what people were supposed to have. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
in my family, my brother was it. He was the man. And I was that isolated sheep that was out there who was always going against the grain. And so to be in this place in my life where I feel like I'm on the top of the world in terms of what I've wanted to work for my whole life, and then to have this sort of visible reminder every single day that people around the country don't have that people who are close to me don't have the ability to be able to make mistakes or to be who they are without tragic consequences. I mean, it's constantly propelling and challenging.
Well, I think the notion that we were talking about of how powerful shame is, and it is the deepest irony, and I'm sure painful,
Yep.
that as you talk about working with the women in prison, the ability to bring your whole self to the table, to not hide any piece of it,
Right.
is so empowering, where people don't believe that it's going to be empowering. People always believe that if you say something that you're ashamed of about yourself, people will reject you,
Right.
and you'll be isolated.
Right.
When we keep having exactly the opposite
Right.
experience, we are instead embraced for our honesty.
Right.
And your brother, and no judgment on him, I mean, it's a judgment on society, who must have felt so shamed. I mean, I don't know if this is the basis of it, but even the fact that he could feel shamed by such a thing is, it's such an indictment against society, and such an underscoring, really, that the truth does set you free.
It does. And I feel like so many of us wear the truth, as like a shield or a cloak or a cape. And I know for myself in my own life that as hard as it has been sometimes to tell the truth, that at least I know every day what I said the day before.
So you don't have to remember any of the lies. That's good.
Exactly, and you learn, I think, as a queer person, the kind of cost that secrecy and social isolation have to you. And to know that we live in a society where all kinds of people have to feel shame, where they don't feel like they can deal with the consequences of telling the truth. I mean, that's why, I will never rest. It's why I know you will never rest, because we will live in a place that people will be able to tell the truth about their lives, and society will be forever transformed.
Well, I would be really silly if I didn't end on that note, because that's just the perfect place for the wrap-up, and we're actually within a minute of our time running out. So let me thank you very, very much. We're going to show the number of the task force at the end of this show, so that you'll be able to find them in Washington, which you probably can anyway, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and Kerry Lobel, its executive director. Wish you great luck.
Thanks.
And I'm really, really glad that you did this.
Thanks, me too.
And for those of you watching, I want to remind you a couple of themes from this show to maybe take away. The one we were talking about in terms of the truth, whatever it is for you, being a freeing thing, and also that no matter what you say and who you are, there's a space for you, because America will get used to it. See you next time.